This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 401, HTTP Headers. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about HTTP headers with our hosts. We're doing things a little bit differently for this episode. We have all of our hosts here to talk about HTTP headers, and we're going to actually focus on Nick's testing of Dries' HTTP header tool. So we'll learn a little bit about HTTP headers and Nick's experience. Let's introduce our hosts. Joining us, as usual, Nick Laughlin, founder of Enlightened Development. How are you, sir?
Doing great. Happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you. Joining us as well, Martin Anderson-Klutz, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
Stephen Cross, a Drupalist and founder of Talking Drupal.
Hey, happy to be here.
And I am John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM. Before we jump into our primary topic, let's turn to Martin. And Martin, what do you have for us for our module of the week this week?
Thanks, John. This week, I thought we would talk about the Content Security Policy module, which adds a content security policy header to allow your Drupal site to inform browsers of trusted sources for JavaScript, CSS, and other external resources. It's a module that was originally created in July of 2017. It has an 8.x-1.19 release ready for Drupal 10. It is very actively maintained, and it currently has 23 open issues, 9 of which are bugs, which is pretty impressive considering the module is in use by almost 16,000 sites. The module is maintained by Gapple, who also maintains a permissions policy module, which has some similar features in that it sets a header to control availability of browser features and APIs to a web application. So content security policy is really a header that provides a layer of security to detect and mitigate certain types of attacks, particularly cross-site scripting and other data injection attacks. That CSP header, as some call it, makes it possible for server administrators to reduce or eliminate vectors by which those cross-site scripting attacks can occur by specifying specifically which domain should be allowed to pull scripts into the browser to be executed. A sort of compliant browser will then only execute scripts from those domains and ignoring any others that might be called by any content within the website. Now, the lack of a CSP header within your website will be cited by testing tools like Lighthouse, PageSpeed Insights, and web page tests. So even in terms of sort of trying to maximize your scores in testing with those kinds of tools, it's definitely a best practice. The Drupal module provides a UI to manage those directives in your site's CSP header and will automatically optimize the policy to remove duplicate directives and reduce header length. The module also includes a content security policy extras submodule, which provides additional security hardening features by altering core services. And it also dispatches an event which can allow other modules to alter policies for each request. So if there's something specialized a particular site is doing, you can have that CSP header, sort of altered to match. And it also includes a number of options for logging any policy violations, including pushing those out to third-party services. Now, Nick, I gather you have some experience with this module, so why don't you give us a rundown on that?
Yeah, so the module itself is great. I mean, it gives you almost every single option under the sun to you to fine-tune those rules. And it also gives some real nice quality of life things. So, for example, some of the common things are, CSS, where CSS can load from, where JavaScript can load from, but you can also control things like where your iframe can load from. And almost every directive has a few sub things, like can you load from the self, from the domain itself? Do you allow unsafe eval? Do you allow unsafe inline? And rather than forcing you to type those, few that are always options. There's just checkboxes for them. So the module itself is great. CSP headers themselves, I mentioned when you said that this was going to be the module leak, I mentioned I have a love-hate relationship with it. And Stephen correctly pointed out that my hate part of that relationship is with CSPs themselves. They will break your site 100% of the time. You won't get it right out of the box. So you do need to test it extensively in the staging environment. You also need to test it locally, and you generally have to test it on production because sometimes those URLs change depending on which environment you're in. And if you miss one of those, your site just will break. You also have to test a lot of pages because different pages, especially with Drupal, load different libraries, and you'll hit some edge cases that you weren't thinking about, or a service will change where they're loading an endpoint from and things will just break. So highly recommend that you use this module because it makes testing and changing very, very easy. But you do need to be prepared if you're using CSP headers, which you should, that things will occasionally break on your site inexplicably. It does have a logging option, not just to the third-party URI, but also to the database logs. So if you want to kind of see what kinds of things are being denied on your site, you can kind of see them in one place. But one of the other biggest complaints I have generally about this is that, especially on more complex sites, the log is very, very, very noisy. So finding out specifically what is breaking on your site and what you want to be blocked, this can take a little bit of work.
So I've got a very simplistic question here, and I don't know, maybe nobody here can answer it, but I'm gonna try anyway, right? So like, it feels like this is pretty important, right? As far as like good kind of like security health for your site. Why doesn't Drupal do this kind of by default? Why is the module necessary, or is it just simply that the module is a admin to manage these headers?
It's very much an advanced kind of configuration thing. It really should remain in contrib, definitely. If Drupal kind of provided CSP headers out of the box, a lot of sites would just be broken, and not everybody needs them. I mean, that maybe that's not true. You really should have CSPs. I take that back. Strike it from the record. It just takes a lot of configuration. Like I said, I don't think I have ever installed the CSP module and not had something unexpectedly break, both in testing and in production. It just has never happened. It's complex, and so I understand them not putting that in core. Also, as new kind of requirements or changes come out, we've had this discussion before on the show, but contrib can react a lot faster to those kinds of things. So a lot of like security-based things like this, it is better to be in contrib because they can react so much faster than core to new requirements or features. And this module stays up pretty up to date. It's really invaluable. If you have a Drupal site and you're installing CSP headers, you 100% should use this module to do it. One of the things too, I think we explored with another client. I have a client that has like really complex and a lot of external libraries, and there were some that they needed to have on the site, but they really, really wanted to lock down. So I think we looked into that event to basically say only put this header on these particular pages. So for example, there was I think it was like a specific iframe that they wanted to put there, but we didn't want content editors putting it on any page. Like we wanted to restrict it to one specific page. And we were able to just say, hey, inject the CSP header only in this circumstance, otherwise don't.
Nick, you mentioned about how putting these headers in place can break a lot of things. I would say from a performance standpoint, I tend to be a big proponent of trying, particularly if you're using sort of one of the major Drupal hosting services that will really provide a complementary CDN anyway. I tend to be a proponent of trying to serve as much as possible of any of those kinds of like JavaScript libraries, web fonts, CSS libraries, serving those from the sort of root domain of the site Is it accurate to say that if you take that kind of approach, you can expect fewer things to be broken by using this module?
Absolutely, but a lot of my bigger clients use Google Tag Manager and partner with big marketing agencies, and so not everything can be easily moved or quickly moved to the root domain. But one of the flip sides, one of the nice things about this is that even if they have access to Tag Manager or something, CSP header means that they can't just add whatever they want. If they add some third-party tool, CSP header is going to block it, right? So it gives them access to Tag Manager. They can change events or change what they need to do. But if they're adding another tool, they still need to talk to a developer so that can be vetted. Because if they just add a third-party script, CSP is going to be like, well, nope, we're not loading that, and then they kind of have to go through the correct pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've definitely talked to developers who were held accountable for performance on the site, but it was really the marketing team that was using Tag Manager to load a bunch of extra things that was actually the cause of some of the big performance problems. So potentially using this as a bit of a firewall to prevent overuse of Tag Manager is also an interesting use case.
You just highlighted every marketing department's worst nightmare is like, hey, we want to add a tracking script to our site, and now we have to go talk to our developers to get the code changed in order to do it, which is like, it's a little bit of a I don't know if it's necessarily chicken and egg sort of thing, but it's like, what's better? Is it better to be open and allow you to enter any scripts as long as they're coming from Tag Manager, or is it better to not just randomly load scripts that aren't being vetted? Obviously the latter seems like a better approach, but I can understand folks in marketing departments or content editors or even site owners being kind of annoyed by that.
I have a few things I'd like to add. So first, when you install this module, there's a report only mode that you can turn on, which is a great way to start with this, because you'll get in your browser header information, you'll get report back in your console of all the things that are broken. It's a great way for you to flip the module on, put it in report only mode, and you'll see stuff coming in the console of things that are busted. It's a great way to introduce to it. The second thing I want to bring up is that we've been chatting about like making CSP work for the libraries that about, right? And make it work with the site and the things that you want to make happen in your website.
Yep.
But once you turn on CSP and get it working, it will also, part of the beauty of it is that if you have a database and people could put content on your site, if someone injects something into your site, into the database, like a cross-site scripting injection, this would block it. So it's not just the libraries that you're working in and knowing about. Once this is activated, it will block the things that you don't know about.
Yeah.
It's an important point of what this is all about.
Or
when you say block, sorry, could you just define block? Do you mean it will block it from loading, or it will block it from being added?
Oh, okay. That's the whole point of this. Yeah. The whole point of this mod of CSP is that you cannot load content from outside your domain unless you've authorized it.
Wait, no, you can't even load stuff inside your domain unless you've
you've authorized it. True. Right. Yes. Right.
Like, and it's at every level. It's like root, domain, self, inline, unsafe inline, and external allow listed items. So it also will, if you're including a script or a tracker and that tracker decides to like change their policy and include something else, it'll break that. And most times it's like, oh, all of a sudden this thing isn't working. You have to look at it. You realize that they included something. Yeah, that's fine. But it can also help you with something like, I'm sure it can help with things like GDPR too. Like if you're working with a company and then they start including a script from a company that isn't GDPR compliant, the CSP will block that. And you can be like, well, hey, we need to find a new company. Whereas if you don't have a CSP, if they change that, you might not notice until you do an audit.
I'd be curious to know how many websites are actually using CSP or not using it at all.
I mean, out of my clients, I'd say probably 30% do.
Yeah, I was going to say less than 50 easily. Yeah. And I think it's awareness too. I think it's just awareness of people knowing how important it is.
Yeah.
And the last thing I was wondering is, do you get higher rankings? Does the ranking of your website get improved when you have CSP activated on your pages?
Lighthouse calls it out, so I would assume, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it shows a commitment to security, and so I think you'd get higher ranked. So it could help with your ranking, maybe.
It probably
shows
depends
a
how you
commitment.
configure it. I should say it probably depends how you configure it, because if you just configure it and just allow unsafe inline,
unsafe allow
and
inline allow,
then
you could, yeah, which brings up a great point. There's a bad way to use CSP too, right?
Yeah. That's actually
allow everything.
That's one of the downsides of native web components with the way that they're implemented. Like, you have to allow inline CSS. Well, you don't have to if you're not using it, but a lot of web component implementations just do inline CSS. So that's something that you generally will need to allow. But yeah, this module is a lifesaver. CSP itself is extremely important. Whenever I'm starting to implement it for a client, I know it's going to be a headache. There's no way around it. You will miss stuff. And like Steven said, the report only option is very important, and you want to run that in every environment, because you'll have local staging, production. Like, if those URLs are different and they're not configured properly, then it'll block them, right? And get ready and be prepared to be reading the console all the time, because that's
report only mode doesn't block anything.
Yeah, but so you need to run that in each environment. You don't want to just run that in your local environment, see what's being blocked, allow that stuff, and then push that up and think that you're good to go. You want to turn it on in report only mode, get that to production first, and kind of review things at that point. So yeah, great module though.
Yeah, seems super useful. Thanks again, Martin, for bringing yet another wonderful module of the week to us. Let's shift into our primary topic, where we're going to talk more about HTTP headers. But I think the first question, at least for me, is to kind of define what an HTTP header is. So, Nick, can you give us a little bit of background on what exactly is an HTTP header?
Yeah, so a header is on both the client and the server. It's a way for the client and server to kind of pass metadata. The client can request stuff from the server based on certain headers, and the server will send a bunch of responses and metadata. It can also be used sometimes to pass information through multiple chained requests. So, for example, if you have a reverse proxy, many times you'll have like an X forwarded for header, which will let the end, Apache know, like, hey, the IP address of the actual person making the request is this, not the reverse proxy. So if you're trying to do something in Drupal, for example, it's very common to block an IP address or ban an IP if it tries logging in too many times. And if you don't have an X forwarded for and you're using reverse proxy, you're going to ban everybody because you will ban the reverse proxy instead of the person actually trying to log in. So short answer, it's a way for the client and server to pass metadata.
Yeah, and that the reverse proxy bit, if anybody's ever used Cloudflare, I think that like you get those kind of header values with Cloudflare quite a bit, if I'm not mistaken.
So, Nick, what are your thoughts on why HTTP headers are important?
Good question. I mean,
well, they're required. I mean,
yeah. I mean, that's one thing. I find myself honestly looking at them most often when dealing with security issues like CSP headers or HSTS, which we'll talk about in a bit, or when I'm trying to figure out why something is caching too long or not caching enough. Those are the two times I'm usually interacting with them the most. But really, they do a lot of work behind the scenes of just like letting the server and client know when they should be dumping a cache and requesting something new, when they should be, for example, if you have a multi-head application where you have multiple servers, headers can be used to also make sure that you're connecting to the same server on each request. So it's not kind of going back to, having to start the whole request chain over each time you refresh the page, for example. So it does a lot of work behind the scenes to just make sure that things are communicating properly.
You actually said something there that I wanted to ask about. So you were talking about caching, right? And I'm wondering, obviously Drupal uses cache tags. Are those cache tags stored in a header?
Yes, they're in the cache tags header, and that's how if you have a reverse proxy, for example, and you're doing a ban request on it, that's how they know. That's how, we don't have to go that far. That's how Drupal knows that something needs to be dumped, because it says we've expired this cache tag at this time. And if it sees a request that has that cache tag in it before the time, it goes, oh, I can't send this response. I need to rebuild the entire response and send it again. But yeah, those are explicitly headers. Which again, related to caching, one of the times that I spend, that's one of the times where I spend looking at cache tags when I'm trying to figure out what object is being cached where. Usually dealing with reverse proxies again.
So Nick, let's not assume that everyone listening to this has explored their headers in the past. So you said you like to look at the headers for cache tags.
Yeah.
How would you find them? Where are they? What? How can I see a header?
That is a great point. So one of the main ways that I do that is if you right click on a website. Also, headers are generally, public. If you're on a website, you can see whatever headers you sent, whatever headers the server sent back to you. So if you are on a website, you right click and inspect, you can go to the network tab, and that's both in Firefox and Chrome. You'll need to refresh the page once you're on that tab, and you'll get a list of a bunch of things. You'll have usually the page that you're on, but any resources that get loaded, like fonts, will also have these. If you click on any of those, you'll see there's a tab called headers, and you will be able to look at them. They're going to be split into two different sections, the response headers and the request headers. So the request headers are the ones that you are sending to the server when your browser made the request. And they include things like, they accept, what type of document you're expecting, caching stuff, etc. And then if you go to the response section, that's all the headers that the server sent back to you in response.
So what kind of you kind of touched on them a little bit just now about the kind of things that are in the headers, but let's talk a little bit more about what information is actually in the header information that you can see.
Yeah, so I generally, like I said, there's a link in the show notes to all the different types of headers. There are a lot of different types of spec headers that are available, that there are specific agreed upon policies and how to use them. You can create custom headers for your application if you need them. But like I said, there are a couple of specific ones, specific groups of ones that I look at usually when I'm debugging something. And the first of that is caching. Those are both on the request side and the response side generally. So for example, if you're logged into the Drupal site, there is a cache control header. And many times if you're logged in, it will send a no cache value for the cache control header. And that tells Drupal, like, hey, this particular request, you shouldn't send a cache response back, you should try to just rebuild the page. On the response side, there's also a cache control header. And for example, one of the more common ones, you'll see public, which is, telling people that it's I think an anonymous cache. It'll tell you the max age. So if a browser has this, how long should the browser keep the cache for until it requests a new one? And there's a bunch of other things like must revalidate, etc. There's also on my website, there's a Cloudflare cache status. So it's telling you whether the Cloudflare cache was a hit or a miss. And if you have a reverse proxy beyond that, there's usually cache control headers for that too, to tell you whether hit or miss. And there's also, if you're on a Drupal site, there's a Drupal cache header, which will tell you if it's hit or miss. Now, one of the more interesting things about headers is they also can be cached. So you can have, if you have a Drupal site behind Cloudflare, when Cloudflare first hits Drupal for the very first time, that cache is going to get missed. Cloudflare will cache the fact that it missed that cache, and every response after that will say that it was a miss, even if it wasn't. But if you were to then dump the Cloudflare cache and it makes a request again to Drupal, and this time it was a hit, that header now gets cached, and it will show that it's always a hit. So you do have to be careful and remember that headers themselves get cached too, many times. So you need to really think about what level in the chain you're in to see if it's a header that, if you're getting the actual result that you're expecting.
So are there we've talked a lot about caching, right? And different headers and the different information that can be found in those headers. I'm wondering, what different types of information can you find? Like, I know, for example, if you look at your headers, you can sometimes understand what content management system you're using, or maybe what hosting provider you're using. Are there other types of information you can kind of glean from looking at certain headers and that sort of thing?
I mean, like you said, you can find out who the host is, or sometimes you can find out if they're using Cloudflare, because Cloudflare has 4 or 5 headers that they put there by default. So the CF cache status, the CF ray, and the ray is like an internal debugging thing. It's like, this is the particular place that, or this is how you trace this particular request if you're trying to debug something on the Cloudflare side. So you can see a lot of information about what route your request is taking. Yeah, I think that's kind of the main ones that you can find out from that, unless there's a lot of custom headers that you're adding in your application for whatever purpose. There's a couple of other classes of headers that I'd like to touch on really quickly, kind of related to the module of the week that we talked about this week, and that is there's a bunch of security related headers. So CSP, the content security policy header, is definitely one of them. It's the list of sources that can load whatever directive on your site. There's also the strict transport security header, which is sometimes called HSTS, which is basically how to, it's a way to enforce HTTPS on your site, right? And how long a site should be unavailable if it doesn't load HTTPS. Typically, you want that to be around 6 months, but that prevents people from, that prevents a pretty significant attack surface on your site. It doesn't allow people to access your site on HTTP, period. So if your certificate expires, people won't be able to access your site, but they also can't do like a man-in-the-middle attack or read credentials. The site will just become unavailable.
Should you set, I'm assuming you should set that header even if you're doing a redirect, say at the server level or the application level?
What do you mean?
So for example, like Drupal has the ability to, well, I guess that's actually a www redirect, but I mean, you could set up a redirect as well for HTTP to HTTPS. Like if you're doing that at, say, your HT access level, should you also have a HSTS header in there. So it's
Yeah.
like kind of like belt and suspenders sort of thing.
Yeah, you should definitely have a redirect, but this should fire before that, so it should redirect. But what it will do is if somebody tries to get around that, it just won't load your site. It just won't allow it. There's also a prefetch. I think there's a prefetch header for HSTS that like has it checked to see if the certificate is valid before it even tries to load it. Both of those, by the way, even more so than the CSP headers, you need to make sure you have your configuration correct, because if you set that and you have it incorrect, your site will be inaccessible until you fix it for as long as that expiration is. So if you set it for 6 months and you have an invalid certificate somewhere, your site will not load until you either fix that or it's been 6 months. So you need to be very, very sure that you've done that correctly. There are a few others security related. And these are some that I learned recently based on the tool that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but there's a permissions policy. So for example, you can tell devices what permissions you allow, camera, accelerometer, for example. So if you block those, the device won't try to load them. There's also a bunch of very specific ones for cross-origin attacks. So on how to allow loading of certain things. So for example, YouTube, if you're loading an iframe from a third-party site, it needs to send some headers as well. And the cross-origin embedder policy allows you a way to say, hey, I'm just loading this anonymously. Don't allow this iframe to do anything, right? So even if you've allowed something in your content security policy, if you don't have the proper credentials on an iframe, then that can be blocked as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of headers. There's a lot of documentation.
I want to ask you a question, Nick, related to this. So
sure.
A header is a section of the HTTP document that gets downloaded to the user's browser.
Yep.
But it's the browser that the user is using that is responsible for implementing the rules that the header has enforced, right? So if you have a header that says, hey, I've got these CSPs or this HSTS requirement, the browser is the one responsible for making that happen. So I'm wondering, are there differences between the browsers and how they implement these requirements that you set forth in the header?
Yes and no. So for example, the one I was just talking about with the cross-origin embedder policy, it does the credentialless value is an experimental option that's just coming out. And I know that Firefox originally didn't have it. Also, I think Firefox, in order for it to work in Firefox, it required me to add an attribute on the iframe in order for it to work. So there was a slight difference there, whereas on Chrome, because it's a spec, I think, provided by Google, and Chrome is developed by Google, I think it kind of worked out of the box. So there can be slight differences between them. I think that brings up a good point, though, actually. If you have, I wonder if that means if there's a malicious browser, it can just ignore the headers. And
that's what I was wondering.
Provide an attack there, too. I mean, that's a sign for, I mean, that the truth is security is multifaceted. And if you're really worried about that kind of stuff, you should also be monitoring the CSP to see what's being denied. And if something is being denied, you should find out, especially if it's something that you don't expect to be on the site, you should find out where that is and remove it, right? You shouldn't just be like, CSP isn't like the last line of defense. It's one of the first lines of defense. So if you see something being denied, somebody, uploaded a script tag or something, and you start seeing that in the reports, you should find out where that was uploaded, who uploaded it, provide them with some new training and remove that script tag from your site or implement it properly. You don't want to rely on CSP permanently because like I said, if there's a malicious browser that gets injected, then it can cause other problems as well.
So Nick, as a developer, can you add information to an existing header? And what are some use cases where that would be useful?
You can. I don't know that I ever. If I have, it's been a very long time. The only time I think I think usually what I end up doing when I'm manipulating headers is removing headers from one level to the next. So, for example, when you have a reverse proxy again, you want Drupal to send the cache tags to the reverse proxy so it can monitor what it should ban when it needs to ban them in the future. But you don't necessarily want to send those cache tags to the end user, especially on more complex pages. I mean, the cache tags, you can have hundreds of cache tags on a page, which, I mean, the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but for performance reasons, why you don't need to send that to the client. There's no need for them to know that information, so you'll strip those out before sending them back. That's more often what happens, is you're stripping tags out before, or headers out before sending them to the next level in the chain. I know that for some more complex applications I was working on that weren't Drupal, we would modify headers to indicate certain status levels. They were custom headers. Like a Lambda would take something in, adjust it, change it, and then spit out a different header to be like, hey, stage 1 was completed, et cetera. So you can kind of track progress throughout a system. Or, the other thing that it would do is like tag itself on one of the tracking ones. Like, hey, it went from this node to this node to this node to this node before it finally arrives. So you can kind of see what specific Lambdas were firing on something. But in Drupal, usually if I have to modify headers, there's a module like CSP for it. Same thing with HSTS. I think there's a module that helps you create those. It's not often that you have to write code to edit and modify headers yourself.
It seems like there's some sort of standard for what should be or not be in your headers for best practices. Are there tools to help you analyze your headers to like say, hey, I'm missing this thing or this thing is wrong? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, so the kind of root of this episode is based on one such tool. So while we had Dries on last week, we were talking about some of the coding that he's done recently on a personal basis that he enjoyed. And he mentioned that he has a tool for looking at headers on sites. And he said he wrote it specifically. I guess it kind of blurs the line between fun and work, because he said that there were some internal Aqua engineers that were trying to debug something that were bumping up against a difficulty there. So he wrote this tool that will analyze your headers and then take the next step and give you some recommendations for performance, for security, etc. And, trying to be funny, I ran it against his site and made a comment about how his site only had 9 out of 10. And then, of course, ran my own site and hit 5 out of 10 and decided that I should fix that. And so it took me about 4 hours to modify everything and get it up and running. I wrote a blog post about it that will be in the show notes if you want to see what I had to do to get it working for my site. But yeah, that tool is great. I mean, it provides a lot of information about the headers, and then it links to the documentation about this specific header as well. So if you're looking at, that's for example, I got all the CSPs up and running, got it working, pushed it up to production, and the Talking Drupal YouTube video wasn't working, and that was because of the cross origin embedder policy I'd mentioned. And the only way I could get that to work was either allow everything, which kind of defeats the purpose of having it, or use the credentialless option. And I had to read the documentation to find out what the credentialless option was and get that working. But the documentation is actually pretty clear. It's better than a lot of documentation out there.
Dig into that a little bit more, right? So like you couldn't just add a CSP rule for allowing from YouTube. Like you had to be more specific than that.
No, so the CSP header by itself would work, but one of the recommendations as well is that you should also have the cross origin embedder, the opener policy, cross origin resource policy, the X-frame options, and the X permitted cross domain policies options. And when you set those with their recommended values, they kind of because this is an iframe, they override the CSP header for that particular rule and block it anyway. And the fix is to have YouTube has to send their own headers, basically saying like, hey, I'm authorized to be embedded on enlighteneddevelopment.com. And Google has some documentation for how to do that. And it didn't work because Google's documentation very often doesn't match reality. So again, the option was to either set the permission, the cross origin embedder policy header to just allow everything, which defeats the purpose, or use the credentialless option. So I think one of the reasons why there's so many different headers for this is because as applications have become more complex and embed things in different ways, the attack surface has increased. And so each of these headers kind of closes a specific hole. And that closing one hole just prevented the YouTube embed from loading properly on my site until I enabled that.
Hey, not that I'm trying to Dries shame anybody here, but John and I are 6 out of 10 on our blogs, and Martin is 5 out of 10. Martin, what's going on here?
Clearly, I have some work to do. So, yeah,
Okay.
Content security policy, HSTS, 2 good starting points, but I'm sure I'll have more to do once I dig into it.
Okay.
I'm not going to lie. Based on this conversation, like before this conversation, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to get to that on my next blog update. And after this conversation, I'm kind of like, yeah, is it really? Do I really need to do it?
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, you should. Absolutely.
It'll also probably be, to be fair, if you're a Drupal site that's on a Drupal host and Drupal is serving the content, a lot of these recommendations are a bit easier to achieve than it was for me. I have a statically generated site that's hosted on Netlify, so I had to generate some of them in.
It's no different though, Nick. How is it different?
Some of them in Cloudflare.
Yeah, I mean, like the headers are the headers, like whether it's static or it's not.
Site. Yeah.
No, in Drupal you have the module for CSP, and you just enter the values, save it, and it works. With Netlify, I have to specify each header individually and manually write the directives in there. And so any update, I have to manually edit that. And then Cloudflare, I think from Netlify, Cloudflare strips HSTS headers, or Netlify doesn't let you set HSTS headers. So I had to set those directly in Cloudflare as well.
Interesting. All right.
Yep.
All right. So maybe I'll
so my, if you listen to the podcast, it was maybe a minute, tongue-in-cheek joke ended up taking a lot more effort than I expected to resolve. I think it was about 4 hours to kind of sit down and get everything resolved. But I learned a lot about headers. I mean, I knew how CSP worked in HSTS, but I had never implemented any of those cross-origin specific ones. And so reading that documentation really enlightened me. It brought some recommendations that I haven't given yet, but I have a couple of clients where security is one of the top priorities, and they don't implement a couple of these headers. So I'm going to talk to them about that in the next week or two. But
so this is good best practice. This is really good best practice, right? And if you build it into your process of building a site and analyzing it, like you do with SEO or anything else, that's where this fits.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it sounds like I have a question here about like why this was important for you, but it feels like to me it was as Steven just said, best practice, but also a great learning experience for you to be able to advise your clients better on their header hygiene if you're looking for a tagline to put on a t-shirt. But like it sounds like it was a great learning experience for that, and allowed you to maybe improve your SEO ranking very slightly. Who knows?
Yeah, and it was a fun challenge. And like I said, I didn't learn just about the headers. I also learned how Netlify works. I learned a little bit about Cloudflare, because I had to set up HSTS through Cloudflare. I had to set up some caching rules there. It was a learning experience on a few different levels. So definitely, I also learned to control my urge to tease about tools because it's going to cost me a few hours of work. But it was definitely a nice challenge. It was a little. I'll be honest. Getting 9 out of 10 took me maybe an hour and a half. It really was the 10 out of 10 that took me.
What was the, sorry, you may have said this and I may have missed it, but what was the 10 out of 10? What was the hard part there? Was it the like the YouTube content or?
No, yes, it was. I had the YouTube stuff working, and then I deployed the last header, and then it broke YouTube, and figuring out how to fix that again took a fair amount of time. And then there were a couple of headers that Cloudflare just insists on sending no matter what, that took, and their documentation pointed at the wrong place because they changed it. So it took a fair amount of effort to find out where to modify.
Nick's highlighting documentation issues left and right here.
Yeah, it also feels like Dries should have a badge that you could put in your footer, right? That says Dries Headers 10 of 10.
Yeah. Right? Well, I will say, by the way, Dries's tool did not account for the credentialless option. So I reached out to him and let him know, and he updated it about a day later to account for that, because it's a new experimental feature. So he didn't account for it.
Okay, right.
Now it does. So I was 10 out of 10, and then I was 9 out of 10 for a couple of days. Then he added that feature and went back to 10 out of 10. So I appreciate the effort that he took too.
So Nick, you've mentioned the Dries tool quite a bit. Are there any other tools that listeners should be aware of in terms of really working with and validating their headers?
Not that I'm specifically aware of. I mean,
which may be why he created the tool.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you said Lighthouse provides some insight into headers, right? But I mean, like, that's probably not as advanced or in depth. Is that fair to say?
I don't recall. You know what? I can run Lighthouse right now on my site and see what they say about it.
Take a look. Yeah, take a look.
Just take a moment.
Interesting to see.
What will be hysterical is if what Lighthouse says is contrary to what you've already done.
No.
Or it says it gives you a Dries score. That would be even better.
Okay, so I don't see where it says anything about headers.
I feel like where I've seen them before, they've showed up in the best practices section of a Lighthouse report.
Let me see. This is fascinating podcasting. I might just cut that part out because, I don't see it. There's nothing on here.
It may only show up if you have a problem.
Yeah. Nope, I found the CSP one. So like you said, it's under best practices. It says trust and safety, ensure CSP is effective against cross-site scripting attacks. Consider using CSP nonces, which basically if you want to be really secure but not allow inline scripts, sometimes you have to allow inline scripts, but you don't want to allow that directive. You can create what's called a nonce, which is essentially a hash for a specific inline script. And so you can say, I'm not allowing inline scripts, but this one particular one, if you see it,
it's
fine.
The exception. It's the exception.
And it's in my experience, it's extremely finicky, and I've never been able to get it to work.
It's very hard to implement and have it pass.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right. It does have that there. I think that's the only header related one, but it's under best practices.
I'm pretty sure I've seen web page test also will, as part of its sort of security grade, if you're missing some of those headers, it'll call that out specifically as well.
I've gone down the Lighthouse rabbit hole, folks. It's a very dangerous rabbit hole to go down. All right. Nick, anything else you'd like to add about your experience with HTTP headers Anything you think our listeners would like to know about that we haven't already talked about?
I don't think so, but I would encourage you to run Dries' tool against it and read the blog post. And if you decide to go on the same journey that I have, I'd be interested to hear what your experience was like. I also would say I don't think having done this for other clients and having done it on my own site, I think some of these values were easier on my site because I really don't have a lot of stuff going on. I mean, I have the episode that automatically
Sorry.
updates, but
Laughing because that's a reigning endorsement to go visit your site.
I mean, I do have kind of a blog there to read, but it's not a complex site with a lot of content, a lot of editors or stuff.
Got it.
Like it's generally a static site. So a lot of these things, rules were pretty easy for me to just say block everything because I don't
Right.
have, Hotjar on my site and Google Tag Manager. I don't even have Google Analytics on my site because, I mean, I don't need it. So a lot of these things were a lot easier to implement on my site. I will say HSTS is important. Make sure you are very aware of what you're doing when you do that, because it can make your site inaccessible for long periods of time. But it is important. CSP headers take a lot of effort, but they're important. Some of the more
also make sure you get that certificate on an auto renew or renew it regularly, right? I always love going to sites where they're like, oh, there's no secure, it's insecure, or like in your case would be blocked because those headers weren't set.
Absolutely. But I would definitely recommend getting those two. Some of the more nuanced core specific ones, I mean, they're probably important, but I think they're a lot higher effort to implement on most sites than they were on my site. Like they're pretty nuanced, I think.
Let me ask one final question before we bring this in for a landing here. Are there any sites or applications where you would say like, you probably don't have to go down the road of like worrying about your headers or doing too much extra stuff with what comes out of the box? Sounds like no, but
I mean, honestly, if your site is purely static, do you need all these headers? I mean, maybe not.
What does static have to?
Ones.
What does static have to do with it? It's where your outside resources are coming from, right?
Well, that's what I mean.
So
like if it's purely static and there's no outside resources, then
okay, all right, okay,
yeah. And there's no way really for people to update it, then yeah, probably not. Like, but that's also one of the ones where it's an easier learning experience to figure out what they do and how they break when you're trying to implement it on a more dynamic site. So
if you had a dynamic website that didn't use any outside resources, it's the same thing.
Well,
right?
Yeah, but a dynamic site
it's not about it being static or dynamic, right? It's about outside links to other places.
Outside links and how people edit it too. Like I was thinking about, like if it's a CMS, it's a much higher, lower barrier to entry for somebody to add a script tag, for example, than if it's just a static site that can only be built from one place.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
But yeah, I mean these are best practices for a reason. Most of them are pretty low effort to implement. Well, medium to low effort to implement, I would say. You should definitely be looking at it in this day and age. It's kind of like, in my mind, it's kind of like the next level of SSL, right? 10 years ago, you would implement SSL only on the pages you needed to. You'd only implement it on the pages that accepted credit card information or login.
Interesting, right? Yeah.
You didn't put it everywhere.
People between URLs.
Yeah. And now you don't release a site that doesn't have SSL. Like you just don't, as a best practice. And I think some of these headers are starting to go that way. HSTS, and I think CSP are very much on that cusp. Like they're becoming, and these tools like the CSP module make it so much easier to implement these things. The problem with CSP is that it is a maintenance thing. It's not one of those things where, like HSTS, for example, once you get your SSL cert renewing properly, you set that once and you forget it. You never have to modify that again. CSP, you're going to kind of have to monitor that and regularly tweak things. As if you're using I would say a normal amount of third-party scripts, and it's a medium-sized site, you're going to have to monitor that. Things will change. Things will break. There's no way around it. But it's definitely becoming one of those things where it's just baked into managing a site.
Very interesting.
I just did a search on Talking Drupal for HSTS.
Yep.
I was surprised that we only talked about it in episode 161. That's
Really?
surprising to me. Yeah.
What was that episode about?
HTTPS.
We did a whole episode on HTTPS.
Interesting.
We did, yeah.
And when was that? How long ago was that show? That was
161 was March 2018.
Oh, we
Okay.
also did CSP. The CSP module is module of the week already.
We did. Yeah, we did
There
a
you go.
CSP module, but it feels like, yeah. Maybe some more topics for the list in the next year.
Maybe we need more security shows. Well, more security shows. That's the takeaway there. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. Thank you all for joining us, and Nick, thanks for kind of bringing your insights to our topic today.
No problem. Maybe I should have said this at the top of the show, but I'm by no means an expert in headers. Just recently took an interest in, I've been dealing with them my whole career, but I'm sure headers are one of those things.
We'll let the listeners come to their own conclusions at this point. Okay?
Well, I was gonna say, I feel like headers is one of those things like SSL, where it's like on its surface it's pretty straightforward to implement, but when you really dive in, there's people whose whole career is dealing with headers. So I'm not on that level, but happy to. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out or corrections. Okay. Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and clicking that big Become a Patron button. All right, we have reached the end of our show. And as we normally do at the end of the show, Martin, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how could they do it?
On all the social and Drupal channels, they can find me as Maniclue. And if they want to read my ramblings, they can also find my blog posts at maniclue.com.
And true or false, they will find you at DrupalCon in a week or so.
That is also true. Actually, quite a bit at the Acquia booth, so please stop by and say hello.
There you go. Steven, what about you? Where can folks find you?
As always, at Stephen Cross everywhere. That's with a PH.
And there you go. Nick Laughlin.
You can find me pretty much everywhere. NXVan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys next week.